In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Across a galaxy consumed by conflict, war wears many faces, roaring through bolter fire and screaming chain blades, yet raging just as fiercely within the fragile minds of those who fight. For in this age, the truest battle is not only against flesh and steel, but against the whispering madness that waits beyond the veil. The Imperium had battled demons and psychers for 10,000 years, had burned witches and sanctioned soul-bound servants of the Emperor in equal measure. They understood the warp. They had catalogued its horrors, but they had never encountered a sorcerer who commanded magic as if it were a science, who bent reality through discipline rather than faith or damnation. They were about to learn that the universe contained mysteries even they had not imagined. Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth, formerly Earth 616 to be precise, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The dimensional rift he'd been studying, a tear in reality bleeding psychic pollution into the New York sanctum, had not originated from any dimension he recognized. Not the dark dimension, not the mindless one's realm, not even the twisted spaces where Shuma Gorath lurked. This was something fundamentally different, something that thought and felt and hungered with the collected screams of trillions. He'd attempted the crimson bands of Sitorak to seal it. The bands had shattered like glass against a tsunami. Now he tumbled through the space between spaces, his cloak of levitation wrapped protectively around him as impossible colors and non-Euclidean geometries assaulted his enhanced perceptions. He could feel something vast watching him. No, 4 somethings, each a wound in causality itself. Rage given form, despair made manifest, ambition crystallized into cruel consciousness, excess refined to its most grotesque apotheosis. Gods, not gods as he understood them, but close enough to make his soul scream warnings. The vortex spat him out above a world of ash and iron. Strange's levitation engaged instinctively, halting his fall 50 feet above a landscape that looked like humanity's worst industrial nightmare had metastasized. Sprawling manufactorums belched toxic smoke into a rust-colored sky. Gothic spires jutted from hive cities that stretched to the horizon, each one adorned with architecture that seemed designed to make the observer feel small and insignificant. Statues of a massive armored figure, repeated endlessly, obsessively, dominated every plaza and rooftop. The eye of Agamotto pulsed erratically against his chest. Time felt wrong here, layered and inconsistent, as if multiple temporal streams existed simultaneously. Wong would tell me this is precisely why we don't investigate cosmic anomalies alone, Strange muttered, scanning his surroundings. His mystical senses reeled from the sheer psychic pressure of this place. Billions of minds, perhaps trillions across this world alone, all broadcasting a single faith-driven thought pattern toward the figure in those statues. The psychic weight of their belief was staggering, a tidal force that made the collective unconscious of Earth seem like a quiet pond. Below him, a patrol of soldiers snapped to attention. They wore flak armor in drab colors, carrying weapons that looked like overgrown laser pointers. But Strange's enhanced sight caught the lethal focus in their eyes, the absolute discipline of their formation. These were not civilians playing soldier. These were warriors who'd seen real horrors. "Unknown contact, void-cursed sorcery detected," one of them shouted into a handheld device. Requesting inquisitorial support, Sector 7 Gamma. The air around Strange suddenly crystallized, with targeting laser beams. A dozen more soldiers emerged from nearby structures, weapons trained on him with admirable speed. He raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, the golden mandalas of eldritch magic flickering to life reflexively before he consciously dismissed them. No need to seem more threatening than necessary. "I mean no harm," Strange called down, his voice carrying clearly despite the industrial din. "I'm not from this world. There's been a dimensional accident. Heresy." The word came from a woman who strode forward with absolute authority. She wore armor of black and red, adorned with skulls and purity seals, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face marked with augmentic implants and burning zealotry. A stylized eye gleamed on her chestplate. Behind her walked two massive figures in power armor, each easily 8 feet tall, their baroque armor decorated with prayers and personal heraldry. Strange's mystical senses screamed danger. The woman radiated authority and possessed a mind like a steel trap, utterly convinced of her righteousness and willing to exterminate anything that threatened her worldview. The armored giants registered as barely human anymore, their genetics rewritten into something transhuman and terrible. "I am Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax of the Ordo Hereticus," the woman announced, her voice cold as the void. "You will submit to immediate psychic evaluation, or you will be executed as a witch. The choice is yours, sorcerer. But know that mercy is not among my virtues." Strange descended slowly, his cloak settling around his shoulders with an almost sentient wariness. As his boots touched the ash-stained rockcrete, he met the Inquisitor's augmented gaze without flinching. He'd faced down Dormammu, bargained with death itself, and shattered time to save his reality. One zealot, no matter how dangerous, would not make him grovel. "I am Dr. Stephen Strange," he said calmly, "and I think we need to talk about the entities trying to corrupt your reality from beyond the veil. Because from what I felt coming through that rift, you're fighting a war you don't fully understand." Inquisitor Greyfax's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to the ornate bolt pistol at her hip. "Seize him." The Space Marines moved with terrifying speed for beings their size. Strange sighed. This was going to be complicated. The inquisitorial detention cell was surprisingly sophisticated. Strange sat cross-legged on the metal bench, hands bound in oversized gauntlets that hummed with a dull, oppressive energy. Null field generators, if he had to guess, designed to suppress psychic phenomena. They were partially effective. His connection to the mystical arts felt muffled, like trying to hear through thick wool, but not severed. These people understood psychic threats well enough to build countermeasures, but their technology operated on principles that didn't quite account for his particular brand of magic. The cloak of levitation hung limply from his shoulders, playing docile. Strange had silently instructed it to remain passive. No need to reveal all his capabilities yet. Through the reinforced door, he could hear fragments of heated discussion. The Inquisitor's voice, sharp and uncompromising. Another voice, older and measured, counseling caution. A third, mechanical and droning, analyzing thaumaturgic readings and warp signature anomalies. Strange closed his eyes and extended his astral senses carefully, probing the boundaries of this place. The effort sent needles of pain through his temples. The null field resisted his attempts, but he gathered crucial information. This facility was part of a massive complex, likely underground. Beyond it, a city of staggering proportions sprawled across the planet's surface. And everywhere, that same psychic pressure, that ocean of faith directed toward the figure from the statues. But underneath that faith, he sensed something far more disturbing. Cracks in reality, places where the membrane between dimensions had worn dangerously thin. And through those cracks, something watched with predatory patience, the same presences he'd felt in the rift, those 4 vast, hungry intelligences. The door hissed open with a pneumatic sigh. Inquisitor Greyfax entered, flanked by one of the Space Marines and a wizened figure in crimson robes whose body was more machine than flesh. Servo arms extended from the robed figure's back like mechanical spider legs, each tipped with different instruments. One eye had been replaced with a telescoping lens array that clicked and whirred as it focused on Strange. Magos biologist Xanthis has completed his preliminary analysis, Greyfax announced, remaining standing while the others took positions behind her. You are not possessed. You are not a sanctioned psyker. Your genetic structure is baseline human with minor variations. Your equipment defies Imperial standard template construction and bears no mark of the Ruinous Powers. She paused, her augmented eye glowing faintly. You are an impossibility, Dr. Strange, and I execute impossibilities. Then you're going to have a very busy career in this galaxy, Strange replied calmly, meeting her gaze. Because from what I've sensed, impossibilities are leaking into your reality at an alarming rate. The Space Marine's hand moved to his bolter. Greyfax raised one finger and the giant warrior stilled instantly, a testament to her authority over even these post-human soldiers. Explain, she commanded. Strange leaned forward slightly, the null field gauntlets clinking softly. I'm a sorcerer from another dimension of reality. In my world, I protect Earth, my Earth, from mystical and dimensional threats. I was investigating a rift, a tear in the fabric of space-time that was bleeding psychic poison into my reality. That rift originated here, in your universe. When I attempted to seal it, I was pulled through. Heretical nonsense, Greyfax said flatly. There is only one reality, the Materium and the Immaterium, the physical realm and the warp. Your claims of other dimensions are... Inquisitor, the mechanical figure interrupted, its voice a synthesized monotone overlaid with binary cant. The subject's thaumaturgic signature does not match any catalogued warp phenomenon. His neural patterns suggest genuine conviction in his stated origins. Probability of deception, 17.3%. Greyfax's jaw tightened. She was a woman who dealt in absolutes, Strange realized. Ambiguity was an enemy she couldn't shoot. Let's approach this pragmatically, Strange suggested. You detected me using power you classify as sorcery or psychic ability. But I'm not possessed by your demons, correct? Correct, Greyfax admitted grudgingly. And I'm not drawing power from the same source as your sanctioned psychers, those individuals you've bound to your Emperor's service. Magos Xanthis's lenses whirred. Confirmed. The subject's power signature originates from an unidentified locus. It bears superficial similarity to warp manipulation, but operates through fundamentally different mechanisms. Then consider the possibility that I'm telling the truth, Strange continued. I've spent years studying dimensional threats, entities that exist beyond conventional reality. The 4 presences I felt coming through that rift. He saw Greyfax's expression shift microscopically. "You know what I'm referring to. You have names for them." The Space Marine spoke for the first time, his voice a deep rumble filtered through his helmet's Vox grill. "The Ruinous Powers, Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, the great enemy. Your chaos gods," Strange said, nodding slowly. "In my world, I've battled entities similar in principle, beings that exist as ideas made manifest, that feed on human emotion and conceptual energy. Dormammu, the Dread One, who consumed an entire dimension. Nightmare, who rules the dream dimension. Shuma Gorath, whose very existence violates the laws of physics." He held Greyfax's gaze steadily. "I know how to fight gods, Inquisitor. And I know when a reality is being eaten from the inside out." Silence filled the cell. Strange could see the calculations running behind Greyfax's eyes, weighing the risk of trusting him against the potential value of his knowledge. The Inquisitor lived in a galaxy where every decision could doom worlds. Paranoia wasn't a character flaw here. It was survival. "Magos Xanthis," Greyfax said finally, not taking her eyes off Strange. "Prepare a controlled testing environment. If this sorcerer possesses knowledge of the archenemy, we will extract it, and if he proves corrupted or useless, you'll execute me," Strange finished. "Yes, you've made that abundantly clear. But answer me one question first, Inquisitor. How long have your people been fighting these chaos gods?" 10,000 years, the Space Marine answered. "Since the Horus Heresy, when the War Master betrayed the God Emperor of mankind," Strange closed his eyes briefly. 10 millennia of war against conceptual entities, and from what he'd sensed, humanity was losing. The cracks in reality were everywhere, slowly widening. These people were holding back an existential tide through faith and firepower alone, without truly understanding what they fought. "Then let me help you understand your enemy," Strange said quietly. "Because in my experience, you can't kill a god by shooting it. You have to comprehend its nature, find the metaphysical wound it represents, and seal it. Brute force just makes things worse." Greyfax studied him for a long moment. "You will be tested, sorcerer. Pray you survive the experience." As they led him from the cell, Strange caught a glimpse through a high window. The planet's sky churned with unnatural colors, aurora-like patterns that hurt to observe directly. His mystical senses registered massive warp storms in the distance, reality literally tearing itself apart. He'd faced the end of his world before, but this was an entire galaxy screaming its death throes, and somewhere in the Immaterium, he could feel one of those vast presences turning its attention toward him. Curious, amused, hungry for the new soul that thought itself clever enough to understand the unknowable. The game had begun. The testing chamber was a cathedral of paranoia. Hexagrammic wards covered every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, each one inscribed with painstaking precision and activated by tech sorcery that married machinery to ritual. Servitors stood in the corners, their lobotomized brains wired directly into psychic dampening equipment that hummed with malevolent purpose. At the chamber's center, a circular platform waited, surrounded by a moat filled with what Strange's mystical senses identified as liquefied psychic crystal, probably harvested from some unfortunate psyker's calcified remains. "Charming," Strange muttered as they removed the null field gauntlets. His hands flexed, the familiar tingle of mystical energy returning like blood flow to a sleeping limb. The cloak stirred against his shoulders, awake and alert now. Inquisitor Greyfax stood behind armored glass in an observation gallery, accompanied by Magos Xanthis and 3 other figures Strange hadn't seen before, 2 wearing the austere robes of what appeared to be priests, and 1 in lighter armor marked with psychic inhibitor equipment. A sanctioned psyker, perhaps, kept on a tight leash. "You claim to understand the nature of the warp," Greyfax's voice echoed through Vox speakers. "Demonstrate. Show us this dimensional magic that operates independently of the Immaterium." Strange stepped onto the platform, feeling the psychic dampeners pressing against his consciousness like atmospheric pressure. These people had built an entire science around suppressing supernatural phenomena. Impressive, if ultimately futile. You couldn't cage infinity with iron bars and prayers. He raised his hands, and the familiar golden mandalas of eldritch magic sparked to life. The Seraphim shield, one of his foundational techniques, materialized as intricate geometric patterns that rotated in 3 dimensions. The ward inscriptions on the walls flared in response, attempting to suppress his casting. But Strange's magic operated on different principles than their warp sorcery, where their psychers apparently channeled the Immaterium's chaotic energies through willpower and faith. Strange drew upon the structured mystical dimensions, or attempted to. The shields flickered, wavered, reformed. Strange frowned, adjusting his technique. The problem wasn't suppression. It was translation. His magic relied on accessing specific mystical dimensions, each with their own laws and energy signatures. But those dimensions didn't exist here, or more precisely, they existed differently. The warp seemed to permeate everything, a psychic ocean underlying all reality, and his attempts to reach past it to the ordered mystical realms were like trying to swim through mud. Fascinating, Magos Xanthis's synthesized voice observed. The thaumaturgic manifestation exhibits non-warp energy signatures, yet cannot maintain cohesion without drawing trace amounts of Immaterium presence. Conclusion: the subject's power source is either non-existent in this reality or fundamentally altered. "Which means he's weakened," Greyfax said, with satisfaction. "Whatever power he possessed in his claimed other dimension doesn't translate fully here." Strange allowed the shields to dissolve, concealing his concern. She was right. His magic functioned at perhaps 85% efficiency, and maintaining even simple constructs required more concentration than usual. The eye of Agamotto pulsed erratically against his chest, its time manipulation abilities registering the temporal inconsistencies caused by the warp's influence. But weakness wasn't the same as helplessness, and understanding the problem was the first step to solving it. "Your warp," Strange called up to the observation gallery, "isn't actually a separate dimension, is it? It's more like a mirror realm, a psychic reflection of material reality, shaped by the thoughts and emotions of conscious beings." One of the robed priests leaned forward, his aged face sharp with interest. "The Emperor's gift allows us to perceive and manipulate the Immaterium, yes, but it is a curse as much as blessing. The warp is infinite chaos, demon-haunted and treacherous, because it reflects the collective unconscious of your species," Strange continued, pacing the platform as his mind worked through the implications. "Every fear, every desire, every violent impulse and dark thought, they don't just echo in the warp, they become the warp. And over time, patterns emerge. Recurring thoughts crystallize into something approximating consciousness. He looked directly at Greyfax. Your chaos gods aren't invaders from another dimension. They're tumors grown from your own species' psychic waste. Khorne is every murderous rage across 1,000,000 worlds. Nurgle is despair and entropy given form. Tzeentch is ambition without restraint. Slaanesh is enough. Greyfax's voice cracked like a whip. You speak forbidden knowledge, sorcerer. Names that summon attention. Strange felt it immediately, a shift in the warp currents around him. Merely speaking those names had drawn something's interest, like blood in water attracting predators. He'd learned in his own universe that certain entities could manifest through excessive attention, but this was orders of magnitude more sensitive. The membrane between reality and unreality was tissue thin here. That's the problem, Strange said quietly. In my reality, dimensional entities have to actively breach our world. They can't manifest without specific rituals or conditions. But here, the barrier is so degraded that merely thinking too hard about them creates a connection. 10,000 years of war has taken its toll, the older priest acknowledged grimly. The Imperium holds 1,000,000 worlds, but the warp grows stronger with each passing century. Faith in the God Emperor provides some protection, but faith isn't protection, Strange interrupted. Faith is just another form of psychic energy feeding into the warp. You're not shielding yourselves, you're adding to the problem. The chamber went deathly silent. Strange could feel the rage radiating from Greyfax, the scandalized horror from the priests. Even the Space Marine's posture shifted minutely, hand moving toward his bolter. That, Greyfax said, with Arctic calm, is the deepest heresy I have heard spoken in my 3 centuries of service. The God Emperor protects. His divine light shields humanity from the darkness. Without him, you'd be extinct, Strange agreed. I'm not disputing that. Whatever this Emperor of yours is or was, his psychic presence clearly provides a stabilizing influence, but it's not solving the fundamental problem. The Chaos Gods exist because conscious beings exist. As long as sapient life experiences rage, despair, ambition, and excess, those entities will persist. They're symptoms of consciousness itself. He gestured broadly at the wards around him. These symbols, this technology, you're treating the warp like an external enemy to be barricaded against. But it's not external, it's internal. Every human mind is a tiny doorway to the Immaterium. You can't fortify against yourself. Magos Xanthus's mechanical appendages twitched with what might have been excitement. Theological implications are significant. If the subject's analysis is accurate, current imperial doctrine regarding warp protection may be fundamentally flawed. Query: what alternative approach does the subject propose? Strange smiled grimly. This was the dangerous part, the moment where he'd either gain their attention or confirm their desire to execute him. In my world, sorcerers like myself use structured techniques to interact with mystical forces safely. Specific gestures, incantations, mental disciplines. They create a framework that channels power without being consumed by it. Your psychers seem to either rely entirely on faith to the Emperor or surrender to the warp's chaos entirely. There's no middle ground, no systematic methodology. He raised his hands again, forming the intricate mudras for the crimson bands of Saitorak. The spell fought him, trying to draw from a dimension that didn't quite exist here, but Strange forced the structure to hold. golden red energy bands materialized, perfectly controlled, mathematically precise in their formation. This is the Vishanti style, ordered, disciplined, repeatable. It doesn't rely on faith or genetic mutation. It's teachable methodology meeting mystical power. If I could adapt these techniques to work with your warp instead of against it, he let the bands dissolve. You might be able to create psychers who don't turn into demon gates the moment their concentration slips. The sanctioned psyker in the observation gallery suddenly ceased, his body convulsing. The two figures beside him grabbed his arms, chanting prayers while pressing inhibitor icons against his flesh. Through his psychic senses, Strange felt what was happening. The man's excitement at Strange's words had opened him to the warp, and something had tried to slip through that crack in his mental defenses. They barely contained it. The psyker slumped, unconscious but alive. "You see the danger," Greyfax said coldly. "Hope is a weapon the Ruinous Powers use against us. Offer a psyker the possibility of control, and Tzeentch's whispers find purchase." "Because you haven't given them actual tools," Strange countered. "Just faith and fear. That's not a defense. It's desperation." He met Greyfax's augmented gaze through the armored glass. "Test me further if you must, Inquisitor. Throw your worst at me. But while you're deciding whether to trust me or execute me, understand this. I've sensed the cracks in your reality. I've felt how close to the edge this galaxy is. You're not fighting a war you can win through attrition. You need a new approach, and I might be the only person in your entire Imperium who can provide it." Greyfax was silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "Magos Xanthis, prepare the demon chamber." Strange's blood chilled. "The what?" "If you truly understand how to combat the Ruinous Powers without faith in the Emperor," Greyfax said with grim satisfaction, "then you'll survive an encounter with one of their servants. If not, we'll simply be rid of another witch." The platform beneath Strange's feet shuddered and began to descend into the floor, into darkness, into something that was already screaming his name. The descent lasted 13 seconds. Strange counted them precisely, using the meditation techniques that had steadied him through countless supernatural encounters. 13 seconds to prepare for whatever fresh hell the Inquisitor had arranged. The platform locked into place with a metallic clang that echoed through a chamber far larger than the testing room above. Strange's eyes adjusted to the dim luminescence of glow globes mounted on distant walls. The demon chamber was a hexagonal arena, perhaps 200 feet across, its walls inscribed with layered wards that pulsed with active power. Chains hung from the ceiling, each one etched with prayers and ending in barbed hooks. At the far end of the chamber, something moved in shadow. No, not shadow. A cage of pure force, shimmering with the telltale distortion of powerful psychic binding, and within it, something that hurt to perceive directly. "Subject is now in proximity to bound demon specimen." Magos Xanthis's voice crackled through vox speakers. "Specimen classification: lesser demon of Tzeentch, herald class entity. Captured 3 weeks prior during assault on Hive Secundus. Psychic binding maintained by Choir Delta 9, 6 sanctioned psychers maintaining ward integrity." Strange felt the eye of Agamotto pulse a warning against his chest. His mystical senses registered the creature's nature immediately. This was no demon as he understood them from Earth's mystical dimensions. This was something far more fundamentally wrong. a thought given impossible flesh, a fragment of conscious malevolence peeled from the psychic wound called Tzeentch and granted terrible independence. The test is simple, Sorcerer, Greyfax's voice announced. We will release psychic containment. You will survive for 5 minutes without invoking the Emperor's name or accepting demonic corruption. Succeed, and I will consider the possibility that your knowledge has value. Fail. She paused meaningfully. Well, the Ruinous Powers destroy their own servants as readily as their enemies. And if I refuse this test, Strange called out, already knowing the answer, then you die as a witch. The result is the same, merely less informative. Strange exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders to loosen tension. The cloak of levitation rippled against his back, ready. His hands traced preparatory mudras, drawing on muscle memory from 10,000 training sessions in the New York sanctum. He'd faced Dormammu in the dark dimension. He'd bargained with death itself and won. One daemon, even from an alien reality, would not be his end. One question before you begin, Strange said. How many of your psychers have survived direct confrontation with this particular specimen? Silence from the observation gallery. 0, Greyfax finally admitted. But they were psychers, their souls already touched by the warp. You claim to operate through different principles. Prove it. The psychic cage flickered once, twice, then vanished entirely. The demon unfolded from its prison like origami in reverse, geometry reassembling itself into a form that violated spatial consistency. It stood perhaps 12 feet tall, its body a constantly shifting mass of iridescent feathers and eyes. Too many eyes, each one containing infinite depth and predatory intelligence. Wings that might have been beautiful in another context spread wide, dripping flames that burned in colors Strange had no names for. A beaked face, or was it 3 faces layered impossibly over one another, spoke in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. Strange. Yes. The architect sees you, little sorcerer lost from home, a mind that thinks itself ordered, structured, disciplined. How delicious, how utterly incorrect. The demon's voice bypassed Strange's ears entirely, speaking directly into his consciousness. He felt the words trying to take root in his thoughts, to remake his understanding of reality according to their speaker's nature. This was how Tzeentch's servants corrupted, not through brute force, but through seductive recontextualization. They made madness seem reasonable. Strange formed the Seraphim shield with both hands, golden mandalas spinning into existence just as the demon lunged. Spectral talons raked across his barrier, and the impact sent feedback pain shooting through his arms. The demon's touch carried metaphysical weight. Each strike wasn't just physical force. It was an assault on the concept of protection itself, trying to convince Strange's shields that they'd already failed. Your magic tastes of other dimensions, the demon hissed, circling him with unnatural speed. The changer of ways sees through you, sees what you were, what you might become. So many pathways, sorcerer, so many possible futures where you scream. Shall I show you? The demon's eyes flared, and suddenly Strange saw himself kneeling before Greyfax as she placed the bolt pistol against his temple. Himself, corrupted and laughing, leading hordes of demons through streets of burning cities. Himself, strapped to an operating table while the Mechanicus peeled away his flesh to study his impossible physiology. Himself, alone in the void between dimensions, screaming for eternity. precognitive visions. Tzeentch specialized in futures and knowledge, and its servants could weaponize possibility itself. But Strange had studied under the Ancient One, had mastered the Eye of Agamotto, had literally rewritten time to trap Dormammu. He knew how to navigate temporal manipulation. "I've seen worse futures," Strange said through gritted teeth, using the words of power to anchor his consciousness to the present moment. "Dormammu showed me infinity. Your parlor tricks don't impress me, demon." He shifted tactics, abandoning pure defense for the crimson bands of Saitorak. The conjuration fought him, still trying to reach through to dimensions that didn't quite align with this reality. But Strange forced it through sheer willpower and technical precision. Ruby-red bands of energy lashed out, attempting to bind the demon's constantly shifting form. The demon laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming children. "Sitarak? Here? Oh, you poor confused thing. There is no crimson cosmos in this reality, no demon lord to grant you power. Your spells are corpses, sorcerer, dead things you drag behind you like rotting memories." The bands flickered and weakened, but they held, barely. Strange was burning through concentration and energy faster than sustainable. The demon was right about one thing. His magic was handicapped here, operating at reduced efficiency and requiring constant mental recalibration. Each spell felt like performing surgery while wearing thick gloves. But Strange hadn't survived as Sorcerer Supreme by relying on raw power alone. He'd survived through intelligence, adaptability, and ruthless pragmatism. He stopped trying to bind the demon and instead traced the winds of Watum, a dispersal spell designed to scatter mystical entities across dimensions. The technique manifested as a spiraling vortex of energy, and for a moment, the demon's form destabilized, its impossible geometry struggling to maintain cohesion against the dispersive force. "Clever," the demon admitted, reforming 10 feet away. Its tone shifted, becoming almost respectful. "You adapt quickly. The architect appreciates this quality. Join us, sorcerer. Tzeentch offers infinite knowledge, mastery over all possible futures. Your disciplined mind could become a perfect vessel for his grand designs. You would understand everything." And there it was, the corruption attempt. Not crude possession, but seduction through the one thing Strange had always craved. Knowledge, understanding, mastery. He felt the temptation like a physical weight. Tzeentch could show him how magic truly worked in this reality, could teach him to wield the warp with perfect control, could reveal the secrets of the chaos gods themselves, how to exploit their weaknesses, how to... No, Strange had been down this road before. The Ancient One had warned him about the dangers of seeking knowledge without wisdom, power without restraint. He'd watched too many sorcerers fall to dark entities by accepting just one bargain, thinking they could control forces that existed specifically to subvert control. "I've turned down offers from entities that make you look like an insect," Strange said coldly. "Dormammu promised me eternal life. Shuma Gorath offered dominion over 1,000 dimensions. Mephisto himself tried to bargain for my soul. You're not even the most persuasive tempter I've met this year." The demon's eyes narrowed, all of them, simultaneously. "Then you will die ignorant and broken, little sorcerer. The architect's patience has limits." It attacked with renewed fury, no longer playing or testing. Spectral flames washed across the chamber, burning in colors that shouldn't exist. Strange's shields held for 3 seconds before shattering, and he was forced to dodge physically, the cloak of levitation carrying him in evasive spirals through the air. Talons raked his side, drawing blood, and the wounds burned with unnatural intensity. Demonic essence trying to corrupt his flesh at the cellular level. Strange formed the shield of the Seraphim again, buying himself seconds to think. The demon was stronger than him here, faster, perfectly adapted to this reality, while he struggled with every casting. Traditional combat wouldn't work. He needed an unconventional approach. His mind raced through options, analyzing the demon's nature through the lens of his mystical education. In his reality, demons were entities from other dimensions, bound by specific rules and vulnerabilities. But this demon was different. It was a thought-given form, a fragment of Tzeentch's consciousness. It wasn't separate from the warp. It was warp, temporarily crystallized into something approximating independent existence, which meant it required a psychic anchor to remain manifest, something tethering it to material reality. Strange's enhanced perception swept the chamber, looking past the physical to the metaphysical. There, chains of invisible energy connecting the demon to the wards on the walls, but not binding it, sustaining it. The Inquisition had captured this creature by providing it a stable anchor point, keeping it manifest for study. "You're not trapped in here with me," Strange realized aloud. "I'm trapped in here with you, but you're both trapped by them. They're keeping you manifest, studying you, using you as a test subject." The demon's laughter cut off abruptly. "Clever sorcerer speaks uncomfortable truths. Yes, we serve the architect, but these flesh things have learned to make cages from our own nature. Ironic, painful. Tzeentch finds it amusing." Strange made a decision that would either save him or doom everyone in the facility. He formed the mirror dimension incantation, or tried to. The spell didn't exist here as it did on Earth, but the underlying principle remained sound. Create a reflective space that mirrors reality without being reality. He poured power into the technique, adapting it on the fly, reshaping it to work with the warp's chaotic energies instead of Earth's mystical dimensions. The air shimmered, cracked. For a moment, Strange thought he'd failed entirely. Then reality folded. The diamond screamed, a sound of pure surprise, as the chamber split into layered reflections. Strange had created something like the mirror dimension, but warped and wrong, unstable. It wouldn't last more than seconds, but seconds were enough. He reached out with mystical senses and severed one of the invisible chains anchoring the demon to material reality. The creature's form destabilized instantly, its impossible geometry collapsing like a house of cards. It wasn't banished. Strange lacked the knowledge to truly destroy a warp entity, but it was disrupted, forced partially back into the Immaterium while still tethered by the remaining anchor points. "Unwise," the demon's voice echoed, fading. "You have shown Tzeentch your capabilities, sorcerer. He sees you now. He wants you now." There is no escape from the architect's attention. The makeshift mirror dimension collapsed, reality reasserting itself. Strange dropped to one knee, breathing hard, blood seeping from the talon wounds in his side. The demon was still partially present, a flickering, half-real shadow, but no longer an immediate threat. Silence from the observation gallery. Then, 4 minutes, 37 seconds, Magos Jantis reported clinically. Subject has survived designated duration. Demon manifestation disrupted through unknown methodology. Psychic anchor integrity compromised. Recommend immediate recontainment protocols. Strange stood slowly, pressing one hand to his bleeding side. He looked up at the observation gallery, at Inquisitor Greyfax's shadowed form behind the armored glass. "I survived your test," he called out hoarsely. "Now will you listen to what I have to say about fighting the Chaos Gods properly? Or do I need to survive something else first?" Greyfax was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was making a decision that terrified her. "Magos Xantis, seal the demon, and bring the sorcerer to my strategium. We have much to discuss." Strange allowed himself a small smile of victory. Then the demon's fading voice whispered directly into his mind. "The game begins, sorcerer. Tzeentch has seen you, and what the architect sees, he claims. Sleep well, if you can. Your dreams now belong to him." The eye of Agamotto pulsed once against Strange's chest. A warning, or perhaps an acknowledgement. The strategium was a war room built for paranoia and grandeur in equal measure. Hololith projectors cast flickering images of star systems and battle formations across a table the size of a landing pad. Servo skulls drifted through the air, their eye sockets replaced with recording equipment that tracked every word spoken. The walls displayed tactical data in streams of glowing text, casualty reports, fleet movements, warp storm predictions. Everything was rendered in the Gothic excess that seemed to define Imperial architecture, as if the Imperium couldn't conceive of utility without ornamentation. Strange stood before the tactical table, his wounds treated by a silent medicae who'd applied antiseptic unguents that stung worse than the demon's talons. The cloak had settled protectively around his shoulders. Still wary, despite the change in setting, Greyfax had positioned herself across from him, flanked by the Space Marine, whose name, Strange had learned, was Brother Sergeant Thalric of the Silver Skulls chapter, and Magos Xantis, whose mechanical appendages tapped rhythmic patterns against the table's surface. The two priests from earlier observation had been replaced by a single figure who radiated quiet authority. An elderly man in ornate robes bearing the aquila, the twin-headed eagle that symbolized the Imperium. His augmented eyes glowed with subdued luminescence, and his presence carried psychic weight that marked him as far more than decorative clergy. High Priest Yannick of the Adeptus Ministorum, Greyfax introduced tersely. He represents the Ecclesiarchy's interest in this matter. Speak carefully, sorcerer. The Church has burned countless heretics for lesser claims than yours. Strange met the priest's gaze calmly. Then we share something in common. I've fought heretical sorcerers in my own reality. The difference is that I try to understand what drives them before resorting to execution. Understanding breeds corruption, Yannick said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone discussing murder. The Ruinous Powers seduce through knowledge. They whisper truths that damn. Better ignorance and faith than wisdom and damnation. Ignorance is what's killing you, Strange replied bluntly. Your Imperium has fought the Chaos Gods for 10,000 years, and you're losing. Slowly, perhaps, but inevitably. Every century the warp encroaches further. Every generation, more worlds fall. You're fighting a holding action against an enemy you refuse to properly understand. Brother Sergeant Thalric's hand moved toward his bolter, but Greyfax raised one finger. The Space Marine stilled, though his posture radiated disapproval. "Bold words from someone who arrived in our galaxy mere hours ago," Greyfax said coldly. "What makes you believe you understand our situation better than those who've waged this war for millennia?" Strange activated the Eye of Agamotto. The artifact pulsed against his chest, and he felt time's flow around him become visible. Streams of probability and causality rendered perceptible to his enhanced senses. It was different here than on Earth, chaotic and turbulent, but the fundamental principles remained. He could see futures branching and collapsing, possibilities crystallizing and dissolving. And what he saw made his blood run cold. "Because I can see where this is heading," he said quietly. "The Eye of Agamotto grants vision across time. It's unreliable here. Your warp distorts temporal mechanics, but I can perceive enough. In 500 years, maybe less, the warp storms will have consumed a third of your Imperium's territory. In 1,000 years, humanity will be scattered across isolated pocket empires, each one slowly suffocating under demonic assault. In 5,000 years," he paused, meeting each person's gaze in turn, "there won't be an Imperium, just screaming and the laughter of thirsting gods." "Conjecture," Magos Xantis stated. "Probability calculations are unreliable when dealing with warp phenomena. The Omnissiah's mysteries do not bow to temporal analysis." "It's not conjecture," Strange insisted. "It's trajectory. You're applying the same solutions to an evolving problem. The Chaos Gods grow stronger with each passing century because they feed on consciousness itself. Every human born adds to their power. Every emotion, every thought, every act of violence or despair becomes sustenance for entities that are already impossibly vast. You can't win a war of attrition against enemies who become stronger the longer you fight them." High Priest Yannick leaned forward, his augmented eyes narrowing. "Then you propose surrender, acceptance of damnation." "I propose adaptation," Strange said firmly. "In my reality, I've studied entities similar to your Chaos Gods, beings that exist as conceptual forces rather than physical entities. Dormammu, for instance, is the dark dimension personified. He doesn't just rule that dimension. He is that dimension. Destroying him would require unmaking an entire plane of existence." He gestured toward the hololith display of warp storms. "Your Chaos Gods are the same. They're not invaders to be repelled. They're symptoms of consciousness itself. You can't kill them, because killing them would require the extinction of all sapient thought." "Then what do you propose?" Greyfax demanded. "Pretty philosophy won't stop demon incursions or chaos cultist uprisings." Strange took a breath, preparing to articulate the theory that had been forming since his arrival. "In my world, dimensional entities can be contained through careful manipulation of the barriers between realities. The Ancient One maintained wards around Earth for centuries, keeping out threats like Dormammu and Shuma Gorath. Not by fighting them directly, that's impossible, but by reinforcing the dimensional membrane, making it harder for them to manifest." He pointed to the tactical display. "Your problem is that the membrane between material reality and the warp is degraded almost everywhere. It's like your entire galaxy has cosmic wounds that never heal. But wounds can be treated and membranes can be reinforced if you understand the underlying mystical architecture. The Emperor's light provides such reinforcement," Yannick said firmly. "His psychic presence shields humanity from the warp's worst excesses." "Yes," Strange agreed, surprising them. And that's precisely why you're failing. You're relying entirely on one source, one impossibly powerful psyker who's been slowly dying for 10 millennia. What happens when that source finally fails? And it will fail. Nothing is eternal, not even gods. The silence that followed was absolute. Strange could feel the rage radiating from every person in the room. He'd just spoken the Imperium's deepest unacknowledged fear aloud. Brother Sergeant Thalric's voice emerged as a growl through his helmet vox. You dare suggest the God Emperor could fail, that Holy Terror itself might fall? I dare suggest that pinning your entire civilization's survival on a single point of failure is catastrophically poor strategy, Strange replied, especially when that single point has been failing slowly for 10,000 years. Your golden throne is life support for a dying god, and everyone in this room knows it. Greyfax's hand moved to her bolt pistol, but she didn't draw. Strange could see the calculation in her augmented eyes, weighing his heresy against the uncomfortable truth of his words. Speak plainly, sorcerer, she said with dangerous calm. What solution do you offer? Strange gestured, and golden light traced patterns in the air, diagrams of mystical architecture, ward structures, dimensional mathematics rendered in three-dimensional visualization. In my reality, the Ancient One created a distributed network of sanctums, mystical fortresses positioned at key points around Earth. Each sanctum maintained local wards that reinforced the dimensional barriers in their region. No single point of failure. If one sanctum fell, the others compensated. He manipulated the light diagrams, showing how the network interconnected. You need something similar, not reliance on the Emperor alone, but a galaxy-wide network of reinforced points where the barrier between reality and warp is actively strengthened. Psychic fortresses, if you will, staffed by psychers trained in disciplined methodology rather than raw faith. We have such fortresses, Magos Xanthis observed. Fortress worlds, shrine worlds. The Cadian Gate stood for 10,000 years as a bastion against the Eye of Terror. Stood, Strange noted. Past tense. Your fortresses are military installations, not mystical architecture. They stop armies, not conceptual invasion. You need fortifications that operate on the metaphysical level, that address the warp itself rather than its physical manifestations. He turned to High Priest Yannick. And you need psychers who won't turn into demon gates the moment their concentration slips. The technique I demonstrated earlier, structured spellcasting using specific gestures and incantations, could provide that. It's not faith-based, and it's not raw warp manipulation. It's a middle path, controlled methodology meeting mystical power. Teaching such techniques would take decades, Greyfax objected. Centuries, perhaps, to spread across the Imperium. We don't have that kind of time. Then start small, Strange suggested. One fortress, one cadre of psychers trained in these techniques. Prove the concept works before attempting galaxy-wide implementation. If it succeeds, you'll have a template to replicate. If it fails, he shrugged. You can execute me for heresy and go back to your slow extinction. Brother Sergeant Thalric spoke again, his voice heavy with suspicion. Why would you help us, sorcerer? You claim to be from another reality, ripped from your home. What stake do you have in the Imperium's survival? Strange met the Space Marine's armored gaze steadily. Because I'm a protector. It's what I do, what I've always done. In my reality, I defend Earth from mystical and dimensional threats. That hasn't changed just because I'm stuck in your universe. And frankly, he gestured at the warp storm displays, the casualty reports streaming across the walls. Watching an entire galactic civilization slowly devour itself through ignorance and dogma offends me on a fundamental level. You have the resources to save yourselves. You just need the knowledge to use them properly. Greyfax studied him for a long moment, her augmented eye whirring as it analyzed his body language, his physiological responses. Finally, she spoke. There is a facility, Bastion Vigilance, a fortress monastery in the Orpheus Salient. It houses a training cadre of sanctioned psychers, those strong enough to be useful but too unstable to be fully trusted. They're essentially prisoners with privileges, kept under constant supervision and used for dangerous psychic operations. She paused. If your techniques have merit, that's where we'd test them, under controlled conditions, with appropriate safeguards. And if the testing goes wrong, Strange asked, if one of your psychers loses control during training, then we execute everyone involved and purge the facility with fire, Greyfax said flatly. Including you. This is not a negotiation, sorcerer. You will work under my direct supervision. You will teach only what I approve. And at the first sign of corruption, the slightest whisper of chaos, taint, I will put a bolt round through your skull personally. Understood? Strange considered the offer. It wasn't ideal. He'd be operating under constant suspicion, one mistake away from execution, teaching techniques to a people who viewed knowledge itself as dangerous. But it was a chance, a genuine opportunity to help a civilization on the brink of existential collapse. And if he was being honest with himself, the challenge intrigued him. Adapting Earth's mystical arts to work with the warp's chaotic energies would require innovative thinking and creative problem-solving. It was exactly the kind of impossible puzzle that had always driven him. Understood? Strange agreed. When do we begin? Immediately, Greyfax said. She turned to Magos Xanthis. Prepare a transport shuttle. We depart for Bastion Vigilance within the hour. To Brother Sergeant Thalric. Assemble a kill team. If the sorcerer proves treacherous, I want him terminated before he can corrupt anyone. As you command, Inquisitor, Thalric acknowledged, though his tone suggested he'd prefer to shoot Strange immediately and save everyone the trouble. High Priest Yannick approached Strange, moving with surprising grace for someone his age. A word of warning, Dr. Strange. The Ruinous Powers are more insidious than you imagine. They don't announce their presence with obvious corruption. They work through subtle compromise, through reasonable-seeming justifications, through the slow erosion of principle. Watch yourself carefully. The moment you believe you're too disciplined to fall is the moment you're most vulnerable. Strange nodded slowly. In my experience, the priest's advice is worth heeding. Thank you. As the meeting broke up and preparations began, Strange stood alone for a moment at the tactical table, studying the hololith displays of warp storms and demon incursions. The eye of Agamotto pulsed softly against his chest, still adjusting to this reality's temporal distortions, still trying to show him futures that remained frustratingly unclear. But one thing was certain. He'd drawn the attention of forces that had been ancient when Earth was young. Tzeentch knew about him now. The architect of fate would be watching, planning, seeking ways to corrupt or destroy this new variable in the eternal game. Strange had faced down Dormammu through time manipulation and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. He'd bargained with death itself, and won. He'd rewritten reality to save his world from dimensional collapse. But this was different. This wasn't one enemy in one dimension. This was 4 impossibly vast entities woven into the psychic fabric of an entire galaxy. This was a war that had already lasted 10,000 years and would likely continue for 10,000 more. And he was going to try to change the course of that war with nothing but technique, discipline, and the arrogant certainty that he could teach an empire to do better. The Ancient One would have called it hubris. Strange called it Tuesday. "Coming, Inquisitor," he said, turning toward the door where Greyfax waited with barely concealed impatience. "Let's go teach your psychers how to properly defend their minds. What could possibly go wrong?" The demon's whispered promise echoed in his memory. "The game begins, sorcerer." Indeed it did. The journey to Bastion Vigilance took 17 days by warp transit, a fact that Strange found deeply unsettling. The Imperium's ships didn't travel faster than light through conventional means. Instead, they plunged into the Immaterium itself, the psychic ocean underlying reality, and navigated through literal hell while reality screamed around them. Strange spent most of the voyage in his assigned quarters, a Spartan cell barely large enough for a cot and a small desk. The walls were inscribed with hexagrammic wards, Greyfax taking no chances, and a servo skull monitored him constantly, its empty eye sockets tracking his every movement. But the solitude gave him time to work, to experiment, to begin the complex task of adapting his mystical techniques to function properly in this reality. The fundamental problem was dimensional access. His magic relied on drawing power from specific mystical dimensions: the Vishanti's light, Sitarak's crimson cosmos, the winds of Watum. But those dimensions either didn't exist here or existed so differently that accessing them required complete recontextualization of his spell structures. The warp, however, was everywhere, an ever-present psychic ocean that permeated all reality like dark matter. If he could learn to draw from it using structured methodology rather than raw faith or chaotic surrender, he might be able to create something genuinely new, a hybrid approach combining Earth's disciplined mysticism with the Immaterium's vast power. It was dangerous work. Every time Strange extended his consciousness into the warp to study its nature, he felt the Chaos God's attention brush against his mind like enormous predators circling a potential meal. Tzeentch's presence was strongest, the architect of fate maintaining particular interest in the sorcerer who thought he could systematize the unsystematizable. But Strange had spent years training his mind to resist psychic intrusion. The mental disciplines of Kamar-Taj, combined with his natural stubbornness and the Eye of Agamotto's protective influence, created barriers that even the Chaos Gods couldn't easily breach. They could watch, they could whisper, but they couldn't simply reach in and rewrite his consciousness. Not yet, anyway. On the 12th day of transit, Brother Sergeant Thalric visited his cell. The Space Marine had to duck significantly to enter, his massive armored frame barely fitting through the doorway. He carried his bolter with casual readiness, a weapon that could reduce Strange to red mist with a single shot. "Inquisitor Greyfax requests your presence in the observation dome," Thalric said, his vox-grilled voice neutral. "We are approaching our destination." Strange stood, the cloak settling around his shoulders. "And you volunteered to escort me personally?" "I'm touched." "I volunteered to ensure you don't attempt corruption of the ship's crew," Thalric corrected. The Inquisitor may see value in your knowledge. I see only risk. You're not wrong, Strange admitted, following the Space Marine into the corridor. I am a risk, but so is doing nothing while your Imperium slowly drowns in demons. Sometimes you have to take calculated chances. Faith in the Emperor is not a chance, Thalric said firmly. It is certainty. You speak of discipline and technique as if they could replace devotion. They cannot. The Emperor protects because we believe he protects. Faith shapes reality in the warp. This is not philosophy. It is mechanism. Strange considered that as they walked. The corridors of the inquisitorial vessel were narrow and oppressive, lit by flickering lumen strips and decorated with devotional imagery. Everywhere he looked, he saw the Imperium's obsessive iconography, the aquila, the skull, endless prayers inscribed on every surface. It was faith as architecture, belief made physically manifest. You're right, Strange said finally. Faith does shape the warp. I've seen enough to understand that, but it's not the only force that shapes it. Discipline can too. Structure, will. The Chaos Gods are manifestations of emotion, rage, despair, ambition. Excess, given terrible consciousness, but consciousness itself can be many things. It can be ordered, purposeful, directed. Heretical thinking, Thalric said, though his tone suggested he was stating fact rather than condemning. The Lectitio Divinitatus teaches that humanity requires the Emperor's light to survive contact with the warp. Any other path leads to damnation. And yet your Grey Knights exist, Strange countered. Space Marines specifically trained to combat demons directly, who maintain their purity through mental conditioning and psychic wards. They prove that technique and discipline have value alongside faith. Thalric was silent for several steps. Finally, the Grey Knights are the Emperor's gift. They carry his gene seed, are forged in his image. You carry nothing but arrogance and alien methodology. Fair assessment, Strange acknowledged. But I'm still here, and your Inquisitor is still willing to let me try. That should tell you something about how desperate your situation really is. They reached the observation dome, a reinforced crystal hemisphere that provided a view of the space beyond the ship. Strange stepped inside and immediately wished he hadn't. The warp was visible here, bleeding through the Geller field that protected the ship from direct Immaterium contact. Colors that shouldn't exist swirled beyond the dome, forming patterns that hurt to observe. Faces appeared and dissolved in the chaos, screaming, laughing, weeping faces made of pure psychic energy. Strange could feel the Chaos God's presences like atmospheric pressure, vast beyond comprehension, eternally hungry, and in the distance, something else. A structure, an impossibility rendered physical through sheer collective faith. Bastion vigilance, Greyfax's voice came from behind him. She stood at the dome's center, hands clasped behind her back, staring out at their destination with the expression of someone who'd long since stopped being impressed by horrors. Fortress Monastery, built directly on the edge of a stable warp rift. It's been standing for 3,000 years, maintained through constant prayer and psychic reinforcement. Strange studied the structure with his enhanced perception. It was massive, a Gothic castle of impossible scale, floating in the void like a spear thrust into the warp itself. Towers and battlements defied conventional physics, held together by faith as much as engineering. And surrounding it, a psychic barrier glowed with golden light, the concentrated belief of thousands of souls maintaining reality's integrity against the Immaterium's constant pressure. "Why build a fortress here?" Strange asked. "Directly adjacent to a warp rift?" "Because proximity to the enemy allows us to monitor them," Greyfax explained. "Bastion Vigilance serves multiple purposes. It houses psychers too dangerous to deploy, but too valuable to execute. It studies demonic manifestations in controlled conditions, and it acts as an early warning system. If the rift widens, we know immediately." "It's bait," Strange realized. "You're using the psychers as bait to study what tries to consume them." "Yes," Greyfax said, without shame. "Every psyker there has volunteered for this duty, understanding that they serve the Imperium through their suffering and sacrifice. Many consider it an honor to die in the Emperor's service." Strange felt disgust curl in his stomach, but kept his expression neutral. This was the Imperium's reality, a civilization so vast and embattled that individual suffering became statistical noise. He'd known intellectually that this galaxy was cruel, but facing the casual acceptance of institutionalized martyrdom still jarred him. "How many psychers are currently stationed there?" he asked. 247, Magos Janthis answered, appearing at the dome's entrance with his usual mechanical precision. "Mortality rate 37% annually. Demon possession incidents 12% annually. Psychic manifestation accidents 28% annually. Overall operational efficiency acceptable within established parameters." "Those are people, not statistics," Strange said sharply. "Those are weapons," Greyfax corrected coldly. "Dangerous, unstable weapons that we point at the enemy and hope they detonate in useful directions. Don't romanticize them, sorcerer. Every psyker there knows what they are and what they're for. The only question is whether your techniques can make them more effective before they inevitably fail." Strange turned away from the view, meeting Greyfax's augmented gaze directly. "If you want me to teach them properly, you need to stop treating them as disposable ammunition. Disciplined technique requires discipline, and discipline requires believing you have a future worth preserving. You can't train someone who expects to die screaming within the year. Then you'll fail," Greyfax said bluntly. "Because that expectation is reality for every psyker in this Imperium. The warp consumes. That's what it does. We can only delay the inevitable and make their deaths useful." "Not if my methods work," Strange insisted. "Not if we can create genuine protective techniques that don't rely solely on faith in a dying god." The silence that followed was dangerous. Thalric's hand moved to his bolter. Magos Xanthis's mechanical appendages froze mid-motion. Even Greyfax's expression shifted from cold calculation to genuine anger. "Speak those words again," she said, with lethal quiet, "and I will execute you myself, regardless of your potential value." Strange held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Point taken. I apologize for the bluntness, but the underlying truth remains. You need alternatives to your current approach. That's why I'm here." The ship shuddered as it began final approach to the fortress. Through the dome, Strange watched as Bastion Vigilance grew larger, its impossible architecture becoming clearer. He could see defensive batteries, landing bays, cathedral spires that served as psychic amplifiers, and he could feel the psychic weight of all those psychers concentrated in one place. 247 souls balanced on the knife's edge between service and damnation. "Final approach commencing," a servitor's voice announced through Vox speakers. "Docking in 14 minutes. All personnel prepare for void to station transition." Greyfax turned toward the exit, then paused. One more thing, Sorcerer. The commander of Bastion Vigilance is Lord Commissar Hala Estes. He's a sanctioned psyker himself, one of the rare individuals strong enough to maintain control while simultaneously commanding others. He has absolute authority over the fortress and everyone in it. If he decides you're corrupted or useless, he can execute you without consulting me. Understood? Understood, Strange acknowledged. Though I'm curious, if he's that powerful and disciplined, why haven't you put him in charge of this entire experiment? Because he's dying, Greyfax said flatly. Like all sanctioned psykers, his connection to the warp is slowly consuming him. He has perhaps 3 more years before he either burns out completely or becomes possessed. We're hoping your techniques might extend that timeline. If they don't, she shrugged. We lose one asset and gain confirmation that your methods are worthless. She left without waiting for a response. Strange stood in the observation dome, staring at Bastion Vigilance as the ship drew closer. This was his chance, his opportunity to prove that disciplined mysticism could work in a reality dominated by faith and chaos. But the weight of expectations felt crushing. These people weren't just skeptical, they were actively hostile to anything that threatened their established worldview, and they were prepared to kill him the moment he failed to deliver results. You're afraid, Thalric observed, still standing guard at the entrance. Terrified, Strange admitted, but fear is just another emotion to master. I've faced down cosmic entities that could unmake reality with a thought. One fortress full of desperate psykers shouldn't be more intimidating than that. And yet it is, Thalric said, because those cosmic entities were external enemies. Here, you face internal skepticism, institutional resistance, and the certainty that failure means death. Different kinds of battles require different kinds of courage. Strange glanced at the Space Marine with new appreciation. That's surprisingly philosophical for someone who threatened to shoot me multiple times. Philosophy and pragmatism are not mutually exclusive, Thalric replied. I will shoot you if you prove corrupted, but I hope you succeed. The Imperium needs victories, Sorcerer, even small ones, even unconventional ones. The ship shuddered again as docking clamps engaged. Through the dome, Strange could see the fortress's main hangar opening like a cathedral's mouth, vast enough to swallow their entire vessel. Inside, he glimpsed rows of space marines in ceremonial guard positions, tech priests maintaining equipment, and robed figures that could only be psykers, their auras visible to his enhanced perception as flickering flames of barely controlled power. 247 people whose lives depended on his ability to translate Earth's mysticism into techniques that worked in a fundamentally hostile reality. No pressure. Time to meet the students, Strange muttered, following Thalric toward the docking bay. The cloak rippled against his shoulders, sensing his tension, offering what comfort an enchanted garment could provide. The eye of Agamotto pulsed once against his chest, showing him a fragmentary vision of possible futures. In some, he saw success, psykers wielding structured magic with confidence and control. In others, he saw fire and screaming, and Greyfax's bolt pistol pressed against his temple. The futures were uncertain, branching wildly with each decision, but that meant they weren't predetermined. That meant he could still change the outcome through skill and determination. Strange had built his entire career on doing the impossible through precise technique and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. This would be no different, he hoped. The air in Bastion Vigilance tasted of ozone, incense, and desperation. Strange stepped from the ship's ramp into a cavernous hangar bay that felt more like a cathedral's nave, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows pierced by flickering lumen candles. Ranks of silent, black-armored stormtroopers lined their path, their hell guns held at a precise parade rest. Their faces were hidden behind faceless helmets, but Strange didn't need to see them to feel their suspicion. It was a physical pressure in the psychically charged air. At the end of the gauntlet stood a man who was clearly Lord Commissar Halaestus. He was tall and gaunt, his frame looking brittle within his impeccably tailored commissar's uniform, adorned with service studs and polished skulls. His face was a road map of strain, pale skin stretched tight over prominent bones. But his eyes burned with a fierce, controlled luminescence. A psychic hood, a delicate-looking framework of psycho-reactive crystals and silver filigree, was fitted over his close-cropped grey hair, humming with contained power. He held a power sword, not drawn, but resting point down before him, his hands clasped over its pommel. Inquisitor Greyfax, Halaestus's voice was a dry rasp, yet it carried through the vast space without effort. Your astropathic message was intriguing. You bring a curiosity into my house. Lord Commissar, Greyfax replied with a curt nod, a rare gesture of respect. This is the individual I informed you of, Dr. Stephen Strange. He claims his methodologies can offer our charges a measure of control we have not previously achieved. Halaestus's burning gaze shifted to Strange, and the Sorcerer Supreme felt the subtle pressure of a powerful psychic probe testing his mental shields. Strange didn't resist, but he didn't open himself either. He simply let the disciplined, layered structure of his defenses speak for itself. The probe withdrew after a moment. He is an island of order in a sea of screams, Halaestus observed, a flicker of genuine interest in his weary eyes. A fascinating paradox. You do not draw from the warp as we do. You impose structure upon it, a dangerous ambition. He took a step forward, his movements precise but burdened. Why have you come to this place of last resorts, Dr. Strange? To teach, Strange said simply. To see if discipline can succeed where faith alone has been forced to compromise. A faint, pained smile touched Halaestus's lips. A diplomat's answer. You stand in a fortress where we sacrifice souls to buy time, and you speak of compromise. Very well. Let us dispense with diplomacy. He turned sharply, his greatcoat swirling. Follow me. Your first lesson begins now. He led them from the hangar into the heart of the fortress. The corridors were narrower here, the walls lined with cells whose doors were solid slabs of plasteel, each inscribed with warding runes and featuring a single, heavily barred viewing slit. The psychic pressure was immense, a cacophony of fear, pain, and flickering hope that pressed against Strange's senses. He could hear muffled weeping, manic laughter, and the low, constant drone of sanctioned prayers from hidden vox casters. They entered a circular chamber that served as a training arena. In its center, a young woman, no older than 20, knelt on the floor, her body trembling. She was garbed in a simple grey robe, her head shaved, her face pale and slick with sweat. A psyker. Her aura was a frantic, untamed thing, lashing out like a wounded animal. Two men in the robes of Scholastica Saicana, monitors, stood at a safe distance, their hands on the hilts of their force swords. "Initiate Lyra," Halaestus announced, his voice cutting through the girl's terrified muttering. Gifted with pyrokinesis, each attempt to manifest her gift results in uncontrolled conflagration. She has incinerated 2 instructors and a servitor. She has 1 week to demonstrate control, or she will be granted the Emperor's peace. Lyra looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "I can't. Please, Lord Commissar. The fire, it speaks to me. It wants to burn everything. The fire is not a separate entity." "Initiate," Halaestus said, his tone relentlessly calm. "It is you, your fear given form. You must master it." "I can't," she sobbed, hugging herself as faint tendrils of smoke began to curl from her fingertips. "This is what you propose to fix, Sorcerer," Greyfax said, her arms crossed. "Show us." Strange stepped forward, ignoring the wary glances of the monitors. He knelt before Lyra, placing himself at her eye level. The heat radiating from her was intensifying. "Lyra," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the chamber's tension. "My name is Stephen. I need you to look at me." Her panicked eyes flickered to his. "It's going to happen again. I can feel it." "It doesn't have to," Strange said. He raised his hands, not in a spell, but in a slow, deliberate gesture. "The power you feel isn't your enemy. It's a tool. But a tool without a handle will burn the one who wields it. I'm going to show you how to make a handle." He began to trace a simple, geometric pattern in the air with his finger. A faint, golden trail of light followed his movement, forming a basic mandala, the shield of the Seraphim, simplified to its most fundamental components. It was a focusing aid, a meditation glyph. "Don't try to control the fire yet," he instructed. "Just try to see this pattern in your mind. Copy it, every line, every angle. Let it be the only thing in your thoughts." Lyra stared, her breathing still ragged. The smoke from her fingers thickened. I can't concentrate." "You can," Strange insisted, his voice hypnotic in its certainty. "This is not about faith in a distant god. This is about confidence in your own mind, your will, your discipline. Trace the lines, Lyra." Her trembling hand rose, and she began to mimic his gesture in the air. A wisp of golden light, faint and unstable, sputtered into existence at her fingertip. The moment it appeared, her fear spiked, and the wisp vanished, replaced by a gout of flame that erupted from her palm, roaring toward Strange's face. Gasps echoed in the chamber. Thalric's bolter came up, but Strange didn't flinch. His hands moved in a blur, the full, complex mandala of the Seraphim shield snapping into existence between them. The fire slammed against the golden, rotating geometric patterns and dissipated, absorbed by the structured energy. There was no explosion, no backlash, just a contained, harmless dispersion of thermal energy. Lyra stared, shocked into silence. Strange held the shield for a moment longer, then let it dissolve. "You see, structure contains power. Chaos consumes it. You reached for power through emotion, fear, and it controlled you. Now, try again. Reach for it through structure." He traced the simple glyph once more. Trembling, her eyes locked on his, Lyra tried again. The golden wisp returned, steadier this time. She traced one line, then another, her brow furrowed in concentration. The heat radiating from her diminished. The smoke faded. She completed the simple, glowing square in the air, and it hung there, shimmering. It was a paltry thing compared to Strange's shields, but it was controlled. It was hers. She let out a shuddering breath, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. The glyph flickered and vanished, but the control remained. She wasn't on fire. A profound silence filled the chamber. Halaestus was the first to speak, his raspy voice barely a whisper. In all my years, I have never seen a nascent pyrokinetic suppress an emergent episode without invocation or inhibitor fields. He turned his burning gaze to Greyfax. Inquisitor, it would appear his arrogance is backed by something substantive. Greyfax's expression was unreadable, but Strange saw the calculations whirring behind her eyes, the cost-benefit analysis of a miracle. The moment of triumph was shattered by a scream from a nearby cell, followed by a blast that shook the heavy door. The air grew cold, and the scent of ozone was replaced by the reek of rotting meat. One of the monitors pressed a rune on his data slate, his face paling. Lord Commissar, Cell Gamma 7, psi levels are spiking, its initiate Kale. He's breaching. Halaestus's weariness vanished, replaced by the lethal focus of a veteran. Demonic possession. Monitors, with me, Sorcerer. This is no longer a lesson. This is the reality. Stand aside or assist, but do not interfere. The cell door shuddered again, the warding runes glowing red-hot. Strange could feel the warp pouring through the poor soul inside, a torrent of chaotic energy giving form to something unspeakable. He looked at Lyra, who was staring in terror at the shaking door, her hard-won control fragile. He looked at Halaestus and Greyfax, readying their weapons for a brutal, desperate suppression. He could stand aside. It was their way, their problem. But that wasn't why he was here. Inquisitor Lord Commissar, Strange said, his hands already moving, weaving the beginnings of a containment spell he'd been theorizing during the voyage. Let me show you the difference between containing a symptom and treating the disease, but you'll need to trust me. The door to Cell Gamma 7 exploded outward in a shower of molten plasteel and warp stuff. What emerged from the cell was no longer Initiate Kale. It was a grotesque marionette of flesh, its limbs elongating and cracking as a being of pure Nurglesque despair puppeteered its form. The air grew thick with the cloying stench of decay, and a psychic miasma of hopelessness washed over them, so potent it made Lyra whimper, and even the stormtroopers took an involuntary step back. The thing that had been Kyle was a bloated, weeping horror, dripping with filth and buzzing with flies that materialized from the warp itself. "Purge it," Halaestus commanded, his voice a whip crack of authority that cut through the psychic despair. His own power sword flared to life with a crackle of blue energy and a nimbus of golden light. His own potent psychic will shone around him. The two monitors raised their force swords, their blades humming with disruptive power. This was the Imperium's solution. Meet the demonic with annihilating force, regardless of the cost to the host. Wait, Strange's voice, amplified by a subtle spell, boomed through the corridor. He stepped in front of the advancing party, his cloak billowing, though there was no wind. You'll kill the boy. The entity is still anchoring itself through his soul. The boy is already dead, one of the monitors shouted, his face a mask of grim certainty. His soul is forfeit. We save what remains, the fortress. The Kale thing lumbered forward, a distended arm swinging, A wave of corrosive slime sprayed from its fingertips. Halaestus met it with a psychic barrier that sizzled and held, but the strain was evident on his face. Strange new argument was useless. They operated on a doctrine of triage so brutal it had become their only truth. He had to show them another way. He didn't try to attack the demon. Instead, his hands wove a new pattern, one of containment and severance. This wasn't a spell from his old reality, not exactly. It was a hybrid, a desperate innovation. He drew power not from the ordered dimensions of the Vishanti, but from the warp itself, using his disciplined mind as a filter, a refining lens. Golden energy, shot through with threads of the Imperium's own distinctive faith-based gold, erupted from his hands, not as a shield, but as a cage of intricate, rotating seals. The crimson bands of Sitarak, reforged in the fires of the Immaterium. The bands of ruby and gold energy snapped around the Kyle thing, binding its limbs and torso. The daemon roared, a sound of bubbling phlegm and shattered sanity, and the bands strained, flickering as the raw chaos of the warp tested their alien structure. Strange gritted his teeth, pouring more will into the construct. It was like trying to lasso a hurricane. "Inquisitor, your power," Strange ground out. "Not to attack, to reinforce. Lend me your will. Focus it through my structure." Greyfax stared at him, her expression a war between instinct and shocking revelation. Her entire life had been spent destroying the unnatural, not collaborating with it. But she had seen him contain Lyra's fire. She had seen the bands hold. With a curse that would blister paint, she raised her hands. She had no formal psychic training, but her will was a titanic thing, a furnace of faith and certainty, a torrent of raw, undirected psychic power. Blazing with her conviction in the Emperor's divinity, surged toward Strange. It was like trying to drink from a fire hose. Her power was chaotic, fervent, and dangerously potent. Strange's carefully built matrix shuddered, on the verge of shattering under its unrefined force. He grunted with the strain, his hands trembling as he fought to channel her raging faith into his disciplined framework. "Not like that," he shouted. "Structure it. Imagine a wall, a fortress, precision, Inquisitor, not power." For a terrifying second, he thought she would fail or refuse. Then he saw her augmented eye whir, her jaw clench. The torrent of energy began to change, to coalesce. It was crude, but it was a start. The golden threads in his crimson bands brightened, strengthening, becoming more solid. "Now, Halaestus," Strange commanded. "The anchor point is in the host's mind. I'm holding the manifestation, but you need to sever its connection, not with a sword, with your mind. Show me the pathway." The Lord Commissar, his own power sword lowered in stunned confusion, looked from the bound demon to Strange. This went against every instinct, every protocol, but he was a psyker of immense skill, and he saw what Strange was doing, creating a surgical tool where the Imperium had only ever wielded a hammer. He closed his eyes, his psychic hood glowing brightly. His consciousness, a sharp, disciplined scalpel compared to Greyfax's blunt hammer, reached out. "I see it," he rasped. "A cord of filth, connecting the Immaterium to the boy's soul. But it is part of him now. To sever it is to kill him." "Not sever," Strange corrected, his voice strained to its limit. The demon was thrashing wildly, the bands beginning to crack. "Salvage. Use my structure as a guide. Isolate the corruption and push it back through the rift. I'll hold the door open for you, then slam it shut. It was an insane plan. A coordinated psychic surgery performed by 3 wildly different practitioners on a patient who was actively trying to kill them, using a methodology that had never existed before this moment. Haliestus nodded, a look of grim understanding on his face. He directed his will, not as a weapon, but as a precise psychic laser, guided by the framework of Strange's spell. He targeted the corrupting connection, not to cut, but to carefully, agonizingly disentangle the demonic presence from Kyle's shredded consciousness. The Kyle thing screamed, a sound of pure, undiluted rage from the demon, and a faint, fading whimper from the boy. Strange felt the pressure against his bands intensify as the entity fought for its foothold in reality. "Now, Greyfax," Strange yelled. "The push, all your faith, all your will, but through the pattern. Imagine a tidal wave contained in a channel." The Inquisitor roared, a wordless cry of imperial fury, and her power slammed forward. But this time, it was directed. It flowed through Strange's matrix, becoming a purified, focused force of banishment. It hit the disentangled demonic essence and drove it back through the psychic wound it had torn in the boy's soul. Strange, his every muscle screaming, performed the final, most delicate part. As Haliestus held the corrupted essence at bay and Greyfax provided the force, he manipulated the very edges of the psychic rift. With a final, intricate gesture, he sutured it shut, using strands of his own mystical energy and the lingering echoes of the Imperium's faith to seal the tear in reality. The effect was instantaneous. The monstrous form of the Kale thing collapsed in on itself, the warp stuff dissolving into foul-smelling smoke. The bloated flesh receded, the lengthened limbs snapped back to their normal proportions with sickening cracks, and the flies vanished. What remained was Initiate Kale, a pale, gaunt young man, unconscious and breathing in shallow, ragged gasps on the floor, surrounded by the fading golden light of Strange's spell. The reek of decay was gone, replaced by the sterile ozone smell of spent power. Silence, deeper than before, descended upon the corridor. The 2 monitors stood frozen, their 4 swords still humming, their faces masks of utter disbelief. The stormtroopers had their hell guns trained on the spot where the demon had been, unsure of what to target now. Lyra was openly weeping, but this time with relief and awe. Haliestus staggered, catching himself on his power sword. The effort had cost him dearly. He looked older, more fragile. He stared at Kale, then at Strange, his burning eyes wide. The host lives. The corruption is gone, not suppressed. Gone. Greyfax lowered her hands, staring at them as if she'd never seen them before. She had channeled the Emperor's light, but through a foreign lattice, to achieve a result she had believed impossible, saving a possessed soul without destroying it. The theological and practical implications were staggering. Strace sank to one knee, breathing heavily, the cloak settling around him like a comforting hand. The hybrid spell had drained him more than any incantation since his battle with Dormammu. He looked at the unconscious boy, alive and clean, and felt a profound, weary satisfaction. He had done it. He had proven his theory. He looked up at Greyfax and Haliestus. "That," he said, his voice hoarse, "is the difference between containing a symptom and treating the disease. You don't have to kill the patient to defeat the infection. You just need a better medicine." Before anyone could respond, a new voice, thin and reedy, spoke from the doorway. It was Lyra. "Teach me," she whispered, her eyes blazing with a new light, not of fear, but of desperate, fervent hope. "Please, teach us all." In the shadowed observation port high above the chamber, a servo skull drifted, its red recording eye glinting. In a private stratageum aboard the ship in orbit, Magos Xanthus watched the feed, his mechanical mind whirring with calculations that threatened to overload his logic circuits. And in the impossible, non-Euclidean labyrinths of the warp, Tzeentch, the changer of ways, paused in his eternal scheming. A new, beautifully unpredictable variable had been introduced to the great game. The sorcerer was not merely resisting corruption, he was offering a cure. The great conspirator felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years, genuine, undiluted curiosity. The game had just become infinitely more interesting. The atmosphere in Bastion Vigilance had transformed. The air, once thick with despair, now crackled with a fragile, electric hope. In the week following Kael's salvation, Strange had not rested. Under the watchful and now deeply conflicted eyes of Inquisitor Greyfax and Lord Commissar Halayestus, he had begun instructing the first cadre of Psychers. They were the most stable, the most willing. 20 men and women who had witnessed the impossible and clung to it like a lifeline. The training chamber was no longer a place of punishment, but a sanctuary of focus. Strange moved among them, his voice a steady, calming presence as he corrected a mudra here, refined a mental visualization there. Golden mandalas, simple but stable, hovered in the air around the room. They were learning the shield of the Seraphim, the first and most vital lesson, how to protect the mind. Remember, the power is not the enemy, Strange instructed, watching as Lyra maintained her shield, a steady, glowing hexagon of light. The lack of control is. Your will is the architect. The warp is the stone. You are not begging for power, nor are you surrendering to it. You are commanding it with precision. Kyle, pale but determined, sat cross-legged nearby. His shield flickered, a legacy of his trauma, but it held. "It's quieter," he murmured, his voice full of wonder. "The whispers, I can still hear them, but they're like noise from another room. The shield muffles them." This was the breakthrough. Strange's hybrid techniques weren't just allowing them to wield power. They were providing a psychic insulation the Imperium's faith-based methods could not consistently offer. It was a revolution happening in microcosm, under the grim shadows of a fortress at the edge of hell. It was in the middle of a lesson on the winds of Watum, a dispersal technique for minor warp manifestations, that the message came. A servo skull glided into the chamber, its single mechanical eye projecting a hazy blue hololith of Magos Xanthus. "Inquisitor, Lord Commissar, Sorcerer, your presence is required in the Strategium immediately. A fleet-wide astropathic communique has been received. The Orpheus salient is under coordinated assault. Multiple demonic incursions converging on the forge world of Metallica." The hope in the chamber shattered, replaced by the familiar, cold dread of the 41st Millennium. In the Strategium, the hololithic display was a tapestry of fire. The forge world of Metallica, a bastion of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was besieged. Warp rifts, like bleeding wounds in reality, had torn open across its surface. Legions of demons poured forth, not as a chaotic horde, but with a chilling coordination. The patterns on the tactical display were clear to Strange's strategic mind. This was a pincer movement, a calculated strike to cripple one of the sector's primary industrial hearts. The patterns of manifestation, Harlestus rasped, leaning heavily on the table. This is not random. This is Tzeentch. The architect of fate is making his move. Greyfax's face was granite. The Imperial and Mechanicus forces are holding, but barely. They are being overwhelmed by the sheer number of incursions. Standard banishment protocols are insufficient. The demons are reforming faster than they can be destroyed. Magos Xanthis' synthesized voice crackled from the Vox. Plus analysis confirms the daemonic entities are utilizing a network of minor warp rifts to reinforce their positions. Conventional warfare is ineffective. Exterminatus has been proposed, but would result in the loss of 17.4% of the sector's total industrial output. An unacceptable loss, Greyfax snapped. She turned her gaze to Strange. It was no longer suspicious. It was assessing, calculating. Your methods, this metaphysical architecture you speak of, can it be applied on this scale? Strange studied the display, the eye of Agamotto pulsing warmly against his chest. He saw the web of rifts not as military problems, but as tears in reality's fabric. He saw the demons not as individual enemies, but as a single, distributed infection. Yes, he said, the word falling into the tense silence. But not by me alone, and not with bolters and battle tanks. Explain, Halaestus commanded. We don't fight the demons, Strange said, his fingers tracing the lines of the hololith. We fight the ground they stand on. These rifts are the problem. They're like open arteries, bleeding the warp into reality. Your current approach is to try and catch the blood. I'm proposing we stitch the wounds shut. He manipulated the controls, highlighting the network of rifts. A single massive banishment ritual, performed simultaneously at the key nexus points of this rift network. We collapse the infrastructure and the daemons lose their anchor. They'll be pulled back into the warp, and the rifts will seal behind them. Impossible, one of the tactical officers stated. To coordinate such a ritual across an entire planet, it would require hundreds of synchronized psychers of immense power. We have neither the numbers nor the control. We have the numbers in the Astra Telepathica and the Mechanicus' own psychers, Strange countered. What you lack is the control. My students have it. They can be the conductors, the anchors. He turned to Halaestus and Greyfax. We use Bastion Vigilance as the focal point. Your sanctioned psychers, guided by my cadre, their wills synchronized through the techniques I've taught them. We don't send them into battle. We use them as a lens to focus a planet-wide counterspell. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was the antithesis of imperial doctrine, not a crusade of violence, but a symphony of will. The risk, Halaestus began, his voice heavy. If it fails, if their concentration breaks, we could create a warp storm that would consume the entire sector. We would be responsible for damning billions. And if we do nothing, billions are damned anyway, Greyfax said, her voice low and fierce. She looked at Strange, and in her eyes he saw the final terrible calculation being made. She saw the Imperium's slow death, and she saw in him a knife that could cut the cancerous growth out, even if it risked killing the patient. This is why you are here. This is the test, not of a single psyker in a cell, but of your philosophy itself. She made her decision. Do it. The following hours were a blur of frantic preparation. Astropathic messages were sent, demanding the immediate compliance of every available psyker on Metallica and in the fleet. Strange, Halaestus, and the newly promoted conductors, Lyra, Kale, and the others, worked tirelessly, creating a complex psychic resonant frequency, a spell of sealing and banishment that could be taught and replicated. In the fortress's central sanctum, 100 psykers knelt in concentric circles, with Strange's 20 students at the innermost ring. The air hummed with power. Halaestus stood at the center with Strange, his psychic hood glowing like a star, ready to channel the collective will. Greyfax stood at the perimeter, her bolt pistol in hand, her role not to participate, but to execute anyone who showed the slightest sign of corruption. "Remember the patterns," Strange's voice echoed in the sanctum. Calm and certain. "You are not individuals. You are a single instrument. Your will is the music. Let it flow through you, not from you. Halaestus will be our conductor. I will be the score." He met Halaestus's gaze and nodded. The Lord Commissar closed his eyes, his mind expanding, touching each of the 100 psykers, then reaching further, across the void to the thousands of others now waiting on Metallica and the ships in orbit. It was a staggering feat of psychic coordination, one that would have been impossible a week ago. "Now," Halaestus whispered. 100 voices in the sanctum and thousands more across the system began the incantation Strange had designed. It was not a prayer to the Emperor, but a declaration of order, a mathematical proof of reality's sovereignty. Golden light erupted from the psykers in Bastion Vigilance, a beam of pure, structured will that lanced into the warp. On the hololith in the Strategium, Greyfax and Magos Xanthus watched, stunned. Across the surface of Metallica, at the designated nexus points, the same golden light flared. Where it touched the bleeding warp rifts, reality screamed. The demons, caught in the act of manifestation, writhed and dissolved, not banished by force, but unmade by the reassertion of natural law. The smaller rifts snapped shut like healed wounds. The larger ones, strained, fought back, Tzeentch's will pushing against this new, ordered intrusion. But the coordinated pressure was too great, too precise. One by one, like lights goings out, the incursions ended. The demonic armies vanished, their forms unraveling into nothingness. The warp receded, the storms calming. On the hololith, Metallica was secure. In the sanctum, the psychic choir fell silent, exhausted, but unbroken. There had been no possessions, no catastrophic failures. Lyra opened her eyes, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face. Kale looked at his hands, clean and steady, and smiled. Halaestus slumped, caught by Brother Sergeant Thalric. The effort had cost him dearly, but he was alive, and in his eyes was a fire that had been extinguished for years. It worked, he breathed. By the throne, it worked. Strange stood amidst them, weary to his bones, but triumphant. He had done it. He had proven that discipline could triumph over chaos on a galactic scale. The victory was short-lived. As the last echoes of the ritual faded, a new presence filled the sanctum. It was not the crude violence of Khorne or the despair of Nurgle. It was a vast, intricate, and infinitely patient intelligence. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the room deepened, twisting into impossible, beautiful, and maddening patterns. A single, resonant voice spoke directly into every mind, a voice of impossible charm and cosmic amusement. "A magnificent performance, little sorcerer. You have orchestrated a symphony of order in my realm of glorious change. I have watched your every move with rapt attention. You have proven yourself a worthy piece upon the board, but the game is far from over. Come, let us converse, you and I. Let us discuss the future you have so boldly tried to rewrite. I offer you not corruption, but enlightenment. The one thing your mortal mind has always craved above all else, truth. A shimmering portal, a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and geometries, irised open in the center of the sanctum. It was not a demonic rift. It was an invitation. Tzeentch was calling, and he was not asking. The silence in the sanctum was absolute, deeper than the void between stars. The triumphant psychers stared, their hard-won hope freezing into terror. The golden light of their ritual had been snuffed out, replaced by the mesmerizing, maddening hues of the portal. It was a tear in reality, but it was pristine, beautiful in a way that hurt the soul. This was not a demonic incursion. It was a summons from a god. "Seal it," Greyfax roared, her bolt pistol rising, her face a mask of pure, instinctive hatred. "All psychers, focus your will. Banish this filth." "No." Stranger's command cut through the panic, his voice strained but clear. He stood between the Inquisitor and the portal, his hands raised in a warding gesture, though he made no move to attack. Don't. That's exactly what he wants. A show of force would be like throwing a pebble into a hurricane. It would give him a measure of our strength, our fear. This isn't an attack. It's a parley. A parley with the great enemy is heresy unto death, Greyfax snarled, but her aim wavered. She had just witnessed the impossible power of his methods. To dismiss him now was folly. "He's not my enemy," Strange said, his eyes locked on the shifting patterns within the portal. "Not yet, and I have bargained with worse." He thought of Dormammu, of Mephisto. He knew the rules of these games. He's curious. We just changed the rules of his eternal war, and he wants to know how. If I refuse, that curiosity will turn to focused annihilation. For all of us. For Metallica. This is a contained problem. Let me keep it that way. Lord Commissar Halaestus, supported by Thalric, spoke in a ragged whisper. "He is right, Inquisitor. This is Tzeentch, the architect of fate. To refuse his invitation is not bravery, it is ignorance. The sorcerer is the variable that provoked this. He must be the one to face the equation." Strange turned to them, his expression grim. "If I'm not back in 1 hour, or if something else comes through that portal, seal this room. Purge it. Don't try to save me." Lyra took a step forward, her face pale. "Dr. Strange, don't. It's what I do," he said, offering her a faint, weary smile. Then, without another word, he stepped through the kaleidoscope. There was no sensation of travel. One moment, he was in the sanctum. The next, he was elsewhere. The Tesseract, the labyrinth of Tzeentch. There was no ground, no sky, only an infinite expanse of shifting, crystalline structures that rearranged themselves according to some unknowable, four-dimensional geometry. Colors bled into sounds, and thoughts took on physical shape, swirling around him like phantom books and whispering serpents. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and forgotten knowledge. At the center of it all, seated on a throne that was both there and not, was the Changer of Ways. It was not a single form, but a cascade of possibilities, a majestic, feathered phoenix of iridescent colors, a writhing, multi-limbed entity of eyes and tentacles, a wise, ancient sage holding a staff that was the universe turned in on itself. All these forms and 1,000,000 others existed simultaneously, layered over one another in a glorious, terrifying superposition. Stephen Strange. The voice was a chorus of 1,000,000,000 whispers. From the first cell dividing to the last star burning out. It was not hostile. It was appreciative. Sorcerer Supreme of a reality that should not touch our own. You have been a delightful distraction. I'm not here for your amusement, Tzeentch, Strange said, his own voice small but steady in the cosmic din. The cloak of levitation wrapped tightly around him, a spot of steadfast crimson in the sea of change. Are you not? The god mused, his form shifting to that of a vast, intricate clockwork owl. You crave knowledge, order, understanding. You have spent your life building structures to contain the infinite, and you have brought your little structures here, to my domain, the domain of infinite potential. You are the most amusing thing to happen in this galaxy since the fall of the Aeldari. This galaxy is dying because of you, Strange stated, his hands subtly tracing defensive patterns, testing the metaphysical laws of this place. His magic responded, but it was sluggish, like trying to swim in honey. Here, he was a guest in the god's own mind. Dying? Evolving! Tzeentch laughed, and the sound was the birth of new physics. Stasis is death, sorcerer. The Imperium's desperate grasp for stability is a slow-motion suicide. I am the embodiment of ambition, of hope, of change. I am the catalyst for all progress, all revolution, all grand designs. Without me, your species would still be cowering in caves, fearing the dark. You're also the embodiment of betrayal, mutation, and lies, Strange countered. You offer power that corrupts, hope that destroys. You are a cancer, not a catalyst. A matter of perspective. The god shifted again, becoming a vast, shimmering library whose shelves stretched into infinity. You see my work as corruption. I see it as editing, improving upon a flawed design. And you, Stephen Strange, are the most fascinating editor to arrive in eons. You do not simply resist. You propose an alternative text. A phantom book floated from the library and opened before Strange. On its pages, he saw the battle for Metallica playing out from 1,000 different angles, in 1,000 different timelines. In most, the world burned. In a handful, the one he had just created, it was saved. You introduced a new variable, a methodology of order that is not reliant on that crumbling corpse on the golden throne. You have shown my brother gods that there are weapons in this war they had not considered. You have made the game interesting again. What do you want? Strange asked, his patience wearing thin. He could feel the god's presence trying to pick apart his mind, not with brute force, but with an overwhelming, seductive logic. I want you to understand the futility of your endeavor, Tzeentch said, his tone becoming conversational, intimate. You believe you can teach these mortals to wall themselves off from the warp, to build their little psychic fortresses, but you misunderstand the fundamental nature of this reality. The warp is not an external ocean. It is the collective unconscious of every thinking being. To wall it out is to wall out a part of themselves. It is a psychological amputation. They will become less than they are. Hollow, stagnant. You would save their lives by killing their souls. The words hit with the force of a physical blow because they echoed a fear Strange had buried deep. Was he offering salvation or spiritual castration? Was the Imperium's brutal, passionate, if doomed existence preferable to a safe, sterile, controlled one? I offer a different path, Tzeentch whispered, the library morphing into a vision of breathtaking beauty. Strange saw a galaxy not of war, but of endless, glorious evolution. Planets reshaped into living art, species transcending their physical forms, knowledge flowing freely. He saw himself at the center of it, not as a soldier, but as a guide, a master of mysteries, unlocking the universe's greatest secrets with Tzeentch as his patron. Serve me, not as a mindless slave, but as a partner. My Sorcerer Supreme in this reality. Together, we could guide this galaxy to its true potential. You would have access to knowledge beyond your wildest dreams. You could master the warp, not just resist it. You could achieve everything you have ever wanted. The temptation was immense. It was everything he had ever striven for as a scholar and a sorcerer, offered on a cosmic platter. He could save this galaxy not through a desperate, grinding war, but through enlightened mastery. He could know everything. He saw the cost. In the beautiful vision, he also saw the subtle horrors, the betrayals woven into the social fabric, the mutations presented as blessings, the endless labyrinthine schemes where every victory contained the seed of a future defeat. It was a galaxy of glorious, beautiful lies. He thought of Lyra's face, a light with hope not for power, but for safety, of Kael, grateful just to be alive and sane, of the brutal, flawed, but very real courage of Greyfax and Haliestus. He had not come here to rule. He had come here to protect. I've seen this offer before, Strange said, his voice cutting through the god's seductive vision. From Dormammu, from Mephisto, from a dozen other would-be tyrants who promised power in exchange for my soul. The answer is always the same. He met the gaze of the infinite being before him, his own will a tiny but unbreakable point of light in the overwhelming darkness. I am a protector. I don't want to master the universe. I want to preserve the right of the people in it to live their own lives, to make their own mistakes, to find their own way, even if that way is flawed, even if it's difficult. Your enlightenment is just another cage. I decline. For a single, terrifying instant, the infinite shifting of Tzeentch's form froze. The chorus of whispers fell silent. The changer of ways was for the first time in millennia, completely and utterly still. The air grew cold with a god's withheld wrath. A disappointing, if predictable, conclusion. The voice was no longer charming. It was the sound of stars going cold. You choose to be a preservative in a universe of flux. So be it. But know this, little sorcerer, you have made yourself the most valuable piece on the board, and I do not simply discard valuable pieces. I break them, and I remake them into something more useful. The vision of the beautiful galaxy shattered. The tesseract convulsed around him. Your new techniques are a fascinating development. A new school of magic. I shall call it the Path of Order, and I shall dedicate a significant portion of my infinite consciousness to its study, to its corruption, and to its ultimate perversion. Every spell you cast, every student you teach from this moment forward will be an experiment in my laboratory. I will learn its every weakness, its every flaw, and when I have perfected my understanding, I will use your own creation to unmake everything you have built. The portal reappeared behind Strange, pulling him backward. The game is far from over, Stephen Strange. It has only just begun. Run back to your little fortress. Teach your little students. Build your walls. I look forward to watching them burn. Strange was thrown back through the portal, stumbling into the sanctum. The kaleidoscopic rift snapped shut behind him, leaving only the scent of ozone and the echoing laughter of a god. He collapsed to one knee, gasping. The Psykers stared, Greyfax and Halastus rushing to his side. "What happened?" Greyfax demanded. "What did the archenemy say?" Strange looked up, his face etched with a new, profound exhaustion. He had won a battle, saved a world, and proven his philosophy could work. And in doing so, he had earned the focused, eternal enmity of a god who now saw his life's work as the most interesting puzzle in the universe. "He said the real war starts now," Strange replied, his voice hollow. The victory at Metallica resonated through the Orpheus salient like a shockwave. A Forge world had been saved not by exterminatus or the sacrifice of 1 billion souls, but by precision, coordination, and a new form of magic. The strange protocols, as Magos Xanthis had clinically designated them, were no longer a heretical theory. They were a tactical asset of incalculable value. Inquisitor Greyfax filed a report so heavily encrypted and contradictory that it would take her Ordo a decade to unravel its true meaning, buying time. Lord Commissar Halaestus, with a newfound lease on life, began the formal integration of these techniques into the Bastion's training regimen, creating the first sanctioned institution of warp discipline that did not rely solely on faith. But Stephen Strange understood the true cost. He stood once more in the observation dome, watching the warp churn at the edges of Bastion vigilance. He had proven that structured magic could work. He had given a sliver of hope to a damned galaxy. But in the eyes of a chaos god, he had not won a victory. He had simply made himself a more compelling opponent. Tzeentch was not a foe to be defeated in a single battle. He was a fundamental force, and he had just been presented with a fascinating new equation to solve. The path of order was now a thread woven into the great conspirator's tapestry, and Strange knew, with the certainty of the Sorcerer Supreme, that Tzeentch would not rest until he had either corrupted it or unraveled it entirely. His work here was both a beginning and an ending. He had lit a candle in the dark, but in doing so, he had drawn the attention of every shadow in the room. The Imperium would now have to walk the razor's edge he had created, harnessing this new power without being consumed by it, fighting a war on two fronts, against the chaos without and the potential for a new, rigid dogma within. Dr. Strange had not come to save the 41st Millennium. Such a thing was impossible. But he had come, and he had changed it. He had introduced the one thing this galaxy of certitudes had forgotten: a better question. And in that, there was a victory that no god, however vast, could ever truly erase.